Welcome to another installment of the Strategic Thinkers series of the Policy Insights Forum. I'm your host, Paul Taillon. Today we have the honor of having Mr. George Takach, the author of Cold War 2.0, Artificial Intelligence and the New Battle Between China, Russia, and America.
Great to be here.
At this point, I would like to ask you to provide for our audience an overview of your new book, particularly what were your interests in pursuing the subject, what were your major findings and concerns that you surfaced in your research and the implications for the West?
Well, the title, in a sense, says it all. I think we're in a new Cold War. You and I are of an age where we remember the first one, but unfortunately, the autocracies of the world, principally Russia and China, have dragged us into a new Cold War. And we could have just called it Cold War II, but because technology is going to play such a fundamental role in this Cold War, hence 2.0, because it's conveying the tech dimension to the current situation. And the reason I wrote it actually was when Russia did its first invasion of Ukraine. It's not called that, but it should be called that. And they annexed Crimea. I was actually very surprised that they did that. But I was even more surprised at the tepid response of the democracies. And partly I was puzzled because in my day-to-day work with tech companies, I was absolutely certain that our technology was superior to what the autocrats had. And technology drives not just military prowess, but also economic strength. And so I was scratching my head saying, you know, why is our response to these aggressive actions so weak? And that's where I started to drill down into the issues. And if the bad news of the book is we're in a new Cold War, the good news is we should be able to prevail in this new Cold War 2.0 if we do some technological things right and then some strategic and operational things right, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But that was the impetus for the book, that nobody was really thinking about it as a Cold War. And just to give you one last quick example, if in 2014 we'd have called it a Cold War and we would have mobilized, public opinion that yes, this is now serious, if we would have sent a message to Moscow and Beijing that this is something, we're on to you guys, we know what's going on, I think we could have prevented the full-scale invasion 8 years later. But because our response was so tepid, because we hadn't raised it to the level of, hey, this is a systemic problem, the autocrats just keep going until the door is shut, and we didn't shut the door.
As you stated in your book, we in the West are in a new Cold War. Reflecting on your research and analysis, what brought you to that conclusion? When, in your view, did it commence?
So, just to pick up on my previous thought, the annexation was in 2014, but it's interesting. There's a school of thought that says it actually goes back to 2008, when Russia was effectively doing the same thing but with Georgia. And if you talk to people who were at NATO headquarters at the time or the OSCE, Russia really at that point started to be very obstreperous. They didn't answer questions. They gave the Kremlin's party line, and the dialogue pretty much dried up in 2008. Now, some people would argue that actually, vis-a-vis Russia, Cold War I never really stopped. There was a short hiatus in the 90s, but then even the first Cold War, which is generally considered to have started right after the Second World War, Hot War, in 1945, You could even argue, well, it actually started in 1917. So dates are always fun to play with. I go with 2014 because of the annexation of Crimea, plus the other protagonist, China. It was around 2014 where they started to get really aggressive in the South China Sea. So if you combine those two, and they started to really press on Hong Kong. And all of that, if you link it to leaders, which is very critical when you analyze an autocracy, because by definition the autocrat is so critical. Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, finds his footing, and then 2 years later he's ready to implement his campaign against the rules-based international order. So we've been at it for roughly 10 years, whether we know it or not.
Does Russia and China have a joint or separate strategies with the objective to usurp and replace the rule-based international order?
So the relationship between Moscow and Beijing is actually quite interesting and even fascinating for those of us who study these things. So strictly speaking, it's not an alliance. So it's not an alliance in the way that we in the democracies think of a NATO or a NORAD or the American alliances in Japan and South Korea and so on. But you may recall that a few weeks before the full-scale invasion, Xi Jinping and Putin met, and they released a 5,000-word document, the key phrase of which is that we have a friendship without limits. Well, it turns out all friendships have limits, and this one's no different. But at one level, China has become very important to Russia. When the sanctions were imposed on Russia, the really big sanctions coming out of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, because there were also sanctions vis-a-vis 2014 and Crimea, but those were pretty tepid. But the big sanctions, when they bit in 2022, a lot of oil, and Russia at the end of the day is a petrostate, that's where they get most of their foreign exchange and so on, a lot of that got redirected to China. And in return, for instance, the car industry manufacturing has shut down in Russia. All the cars that are being purchased now in Russia come from China. And there's a lot of that increased economic support from China. So in that sense, they're very important to each other. I think Russia's not happy about becoming somewhat of a vassal state to China, but you got to do what you got to do, especially when the war in Ukraine is not going that well. And there's lots of room for friction in this relationship. Russia has reached out to North Korea, as you know, and they've gotten over 1 million artillery shells from North Korea. Yeah, it's completely extraordinary. And in return, Russia's likely giving North Korea technology that the UN resolutions that Russia originally signed prevented from happening, but they're breaching all these rules and laws. But to my earlier point, this increased connection between the Russians and the North Koreans has the Chinese a little bit miffed.
Right.
Because North Korea was always their vassal state, and they had a special relationship. Same with Iran. It's very interesting. Again, Russia's in a difficult position, so they've been buying Shahed drones from Iran. And people are saying, oh, they're getting much closer to each other. Yes, but again, there's lots of room for future conflict because China is the biggest buyer of essentially contraband Iranian oil. And so the Iranians don't like that Russia is now a competitor to theirs. And Saudi, which is, of course, a long time, you have to be careful with these words, I won't say opponent, well, let's call it opponent of Iran, Saudi's selling a lot of oil to China as well. And China's very, very smart, and they only buy sort of 500,000 barrels from each a day, and they keep them all on their toes. So it's an interesting relationship, but it's also a useful one. My sources tell me that, when Putin was rattling the nuclear weapon scenario, that it was actually the Biden administration that called up Xi Jinping and said, look, you've got to send a message to Putin that the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would simply not fly, and there really would be a massive response. And apparently the Chinese have helped facilitate that messaging. So on the one hand, of course, it's disturbing that this relationship has developed between Moscow and Beijing. On the other hand, it has some positives to the extent influence can be brought to bear on Moscow. But what they're both agreed on, and this is a core part of your question, is they are both adamant about pushing back on the so-called rules-based international order, which has, I believe, been a fantastic basis for the achievement of trade and prosperity. And the irony being, of course, with China, 800 million Chinese have been pulled out of poverty.
Yes.
Why? Because the bulk of what they've managed to produce and manufacture, they're sitting on shelves at Walmarts in the United States and in Europe and all over the world. And all of that was courtesy of the rules-based international order. But now that China's at a certain point in its own development, and we'll get into this on the South China Sea, they're saying, well, those rules are for maybe the democracies, but we get to set our own rules. And their own rules are not rules, they're might is right. And that's, of course, very, very disturbing.
You highlighted in your book, George, cognitive warfare, gray zone methodologies, economic coercion, proxy wars as recognizable methodologies in attacking the West. Are there any other non-kinetic or kinetic methodologies that you perceive will be utilized in the future?
Well, let's just, for your audience, make sure we're on the same plane and just take a moment on each of these. So cognitive warfare is the use of technological means, but principally social media, which, again, it's ironic, it was invented in the democracies and now it's being used against us. But if you think of the old propaganda days and radio waves, I was in Taiwan recently, and if you go to Kinmen Island, which is only 3 kilometers from the China coast, there's a it's the biggest music speaker I've ever seen. It's like 2 stories tall, and it has 24 huge woofers and tweeters, and they used to, basically transmit messages.
Really?
Back in the 1950s and 60s. So we've had cognitive warfare for decades, but the way it's done now through social media, very sophisticated. Read the Mueller report about how the Russians did their social media influencing in the 2016 election. They'd go into chat groups, and they wouldn't be crude or obvious. They'd just be, someone else joining the chat group. And then after 6 months, a few messages would start to come from this source. And you'd see the others in the chat group in Minneapolis start to, yeah, that's not right. And they'd polarize slowly and in a very sort of methodical way. So they're very sophisticated. It was actually Prigozhin who came up with that internet troll mechanic, and he obviously didn't provide for his own future well-being sufficiently. So we're getting cognitive warfare out of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Gray zone methodologies, your second thought, is it's using more kinetic / military equipment and kit, but not to actually inflict damage or loss of life. So in Taiwan, which is probably the primary gray zone front right now, you'll recall when Nancy Pelosi visited in August of 2022, the Chinese launched a number of live missiles, so with real warheads primed. Now, they didn't hit Taiwan. They went over Taiwan and then landed very close to Taiwan, but in the water on the other side. The messaging being, we just have to make a few adjustments and they will land on you. And then naval ships encircling the island for 4 or 5 days.
Yes.
Essentially, Taiwan was blockaded. So those gray zone methodologies are very real. The other one in Taiwan that I heard a lot about when I was there, the Chinese jet fighters would take off from China. They'd cross the so-called median line, the halfway point in the Taiwan Strait, and historically they'd just quickly fly into essentially Taiwan airspace and then scoot back out. And this is, again, it's training for the Chinese. It keeps the Taiwanese on edge. There's a psychological dimension. Well, now, because they've ratcheted up the gray zone tactics, they'll fly across the median zone, and then rather than go back home right away, they fly south along the coast of Taiwan, and then they go back. So particularly in the wake of the January election in Taiwan, just now, 2 months ago, that elected, again, a president that is clearly not interested in becoming or having Taiwan become a part of China, you're going to see this ratchet up. So that's a gray zone methodology. Economic coercion, well, we actually know this in Canada vis-a-vis China. When they stop buying our canola or some other commodity from us to punish us, or a very creative economic coercion is Chinese tourists, represent very significant dollars to the hospitality industry all over the world. Well, Xi Jinping, dials that up and down at will, and a lot of countries have gotten their Chinese tourists back, but Canada's way down the list and sort of hasn't. So the economic interdependence that the West has with China, which is a very interesting new feature in this Cold War, because in Cold War I, the Soviet Union was pretty much on its own. They had their East Bloc satellite states, but we didn't have tape recorders as a kid made in Moscow by any stretch, whereas, China for Canada is the second largest trading partner and so on. So how that interdependence on the economic front works out will be one of the big interesting dynamics of the current Cold War. And then finally, proxy wars, which were very common in Cold War I, Korea, Vietnam, many, many others. Ukraine has, in a sense, become a proxy war, because although there are no boots on the ground worn by Americans or other NATO powers, clearly the supply of weapons, ammunition, intelligence, very, very important, both satellite-based as well as those P-8s that Canada is now buying as well. They don't actually go into Ukrainian airspace, so you get all these funny lines being drawn as to what we can and can't do to help. But because they have over-the-horizon radar capability, it's enough that they be in Poland and Romania, but we can still feed intelligence or Starlink.
Yes, yeah.
Some of the private sector technologies are very interesting. In terms of what else might come, while Putin hasn't sort of rattled his nuclear saber directly, a couple of weeks ago, you'll remember, they're now touting a weapon, nuclear-based weapon, that could be launched up into low orbit and destroy a bunch of our satellites. Now, it'll destroy their own as well, but in the balance of power right now, I think they're quite keen to try to knock out some of our communication satellites, and for military intelligence reasons. So, I would put that on the list as something that, and maybe not using a nuclear weapon initially, but space, which is the ultimate high ground in a military sense, expects some stuff to happen up there. Because I think the Russians are really pissed off at the quality of the intel that the Ukrainians are receiving, and the other one is drones.
Right.
If there's a single, here I'm going to date ourselves a bit. Do you remember the movie where the fellow says, "I have one word for you"? This is to Dustin Hoffman. And he says it's plastics, and this is
plastics.
This is the late 1960s.
The Graduate.
The Graduate.
Graduate.
This is late 1960s. Well, I have one word for you: drones.
Drones.
I actually think that the last fighter pilot has been born.
I would agree with you there.
Maybe small, maybe just 2 years old, but I think what drones will do is kind of like South Korea's Kia or Hyundai. It's not a Mercedes.
Right.
It's not a BMW, so it's not an F-35, but it can do 80% at 20% of the cost. And cost is becoming not unreasonably, a very, very important factor. In the book, I actually have, because I know you're a history buff, in the 1300s, when the British invented the longbow.
Right. Yes.
And they beat the French at Agincourt and some other battles. It wasn't just that the longbow was more powerful than the knight on the horse. It was that the longbow archer was a fraction of the cost of a knight. So you could either have many more longbow archers on the field, or you could have a fewer number but save a bunch of dough. And then you wouldn't be in hock to the bankers and so on, or to a parliament and et cetera. So there's a dynamic like that I talk about in the book that will also drive sort of a number of sort of operational and sort of strategic and tactical issues around this technology. So we will, it's a very interesting question that you ask about, what else is coming, because money's tight everywhere.
Absolutely.
Everywhere.
And we'll be getting tighter, I think.
And we'll be getting tighter. And look, even Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he left the presidency, he said, it pains me every time I spend $1 on the military.
Yeah.
That's $1 less for education or healthcare and so on. I don't have a tin ear for that issue. So anything that the military sort of industrial community can do to come up with cheaper solutions is to be encouraged for sure.
George, you discussed the ongoing South China dispute utilizing the 9-dash line and describe it as a brute force strategy. How do you see the Communist China's South China Sea strategy evolving? And are there any measures or initiatives that the West can undertake in order to stymie or counter China's aggressive territorial aspirations here?
So this is a really important issue, the South China Sea. I think all of your listeners, watchers, will be familiar with the war in Ukraine. And that is, the most fundamental form of violating the rules-based international order, because we have a United Nations Charter that frankly, its entire point is to stop aggressive war,
Right.
to respect each country's sovereignty. So that's principle number one. But then the United Nations goes on in a number of other ways to facilitate the peaceful resolution of disputes among countries. And in the South China Sea, and you can see it on the graphics that are now on the screen, it's a big body of water. Mm-hmm. It's a critical body of water. $3 trillion of shipping goes through it. 50% of all the container traffic in the world goes through the Taillon Strait, which is at the top end of the South China Sea. But of course, it's not just shipping anymore. It's fishing to a certain extent, but it's minerals.
Right.
It's the seabed, both what's under it in terms of oil and gas, and of course now it's the mining of these iron ore nodules and so on. So it's very, very important. When I was at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, still one of the finest international affairs schools in the world, here, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was just sort of coming to a conclusion. It was percolating, 10 years of negotiations. The Chinese were involved, the Russians were involved. Like, everybody agreed this is how, civilized states should figure out how to draw maritime boundaries, both the 12-mile limit and then this new concept of an exclusive economic zone, 200 miles. And you'll see on the graphic on the screen, the blue indicates how you would divide up the South China Sea under the UNCLOS rules, under the United Nations rules. And by the way, just as an aside, Canada and the U.S. had a dispute over how to draw this exclusive economic zone off of Nova Scotia. And we ultimately couldn't settle, and we went to court, the International Court of Justice, and they drew a line, and both the Americans and the Canadians said, that's a reasonable, we both understood where the judges were. Neither of us were entirely happy.
Right.
As you never are entirely happy when you go to court, usually. But that's how you settle a dispute like that. China comes along, and you'll see on the screen, it's the red dash line. They just ignore the process of everything that went on with the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, and they are basically claiming 90% of the South China Sea to themselves. And when this came out and started to really get some airtime, again, I was just floored. Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and especially the Philippines, all up in arms. And the Philippines finally took them to court. Part of your question is, well, what can be done? The Chinese didn't show up in court. They said, not interested. This is part of your rules-based international order. We don't use that. They got a great decision, the Filipinos did. Clear as day that the Chinese were in violation of all the rules. Again, China not interested in the decision. It's a travesty of, American-based rules trying to, rule the world. And beyond just the drawing of the lines, they've been militarizing a number of the islands.
Yes, I have.
That are clearly within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. And again, on the screen, you'll see a couple of these pictures. There's one called Mischief Reef.
Mischief Reef, yes.
Which, Hollywood couldn't have come up with a better term for this particular little island. So imagine palm trees, swaying in the breeze, a little green paradise in the middle of a beautiful blue ocean. And then now go to what it is today.
Yes.
And it's basically a Chinese military base. It has a 3.1 kilometer airstrip. military grade for fighters and bombers. It has missile batteries. It has high-end radar installations. And all of this done in waters that belong to the Philippines. The one that they're fighting over now, which again is straight out of Hollywood, it's called Scarborough Shoal. So it's a little bit north, but again, smack dab in the Filipino exclusive economic zone. This is where the Philippines are finally pushing back and saying enough is enough. So they've taken an old, almost World War II era ship and have grounded it against the Scarborough Shoal. And they're planting their flag saying, well, this is ours. And the Chinese Coast Guard is pushing back. Now, the Chinese Coast Guard in any other country would be the Navy. Coast Guard ships are sort of small and they have a crew of 15. You look at a Chinese Coast Guard ship and it's bigger than our Halifax destroyers. They just happen to be painted white, but let's not mistake what they are. So they're trying to block resupply. So now they're the Filipinos are using helicopters to resupply and so on. So it all seems a little bit funny to talk about how this is going, but it's very, very serious because the Philippines has a mutual defense treaty with the Americans. And it works very similar to our Article 5 within NATO. If the Chinese did attack that ship, the Americans would be required to come to their defense. So the South China Sea right now, I think, is, obviously beyond the Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East, it is the next powder keg that with a spark or two could instantly bring us to a major conflict. But you've got to do something.
Yes.
Because the way the autocrat mind works is they keep pushing, they push, and until there's a firm response, they won't stop. We use this in the Cold War analogy. I remember it was the Russian bear.
Yes.
And the analogy was, the hotel floor, and they'd try every room, and if the doors were open, they'd walk in. And if it was locked, well, okay, then I'll go on to the next one. So we have to lock down our doors. I'll never forget, in the Obama administration, Obama would meet with his counterpart and say, would you please stop militarizing the islands, please? And his counterpart would say, fine. And for 2 months, they put down tools.
Right.
They didn't remove the cranes, though, which should have given them some sense that, well, maybe they hadn't all gone home. And then in the third month, it just started up again. Biden's done the same thing with cyber attacks.
Right.
Please stop your cyber attacks. And so for a month or two, they dampen down, and then they start up again. So, again, as history buffs, we've learned that appeasement just fuels aggression from autocracies. Unfortunately, that's the dynamic that we're up against.
George, you clearly point out that autocratic nations are strategically focused on employing, on a large scale, aggressive methodologies so as to coerce weaker nations into submitting to their strategic design. How can the West address this ongoing phenomena?
Everything that I've said so far is kind of the bad news part of my book, and we start to maybe turn a little bit to sort of some of the good news. And the good news is, in a technologically driven world, both civilian and military, the great news is we actually have better tech than the autocrats. Now, we have to use it better, we have to deploy it, more intelligently, more effectively. And this is, your question is raising a critical point about alliances. The the smaller states, the smaller democracies, within the democracy community, they don't have access to the same technology that the Americans, the British, the French, the Germans have. And so alliances become critical for sharing that. But, and this is the takeaway from this particular question, just buying American isn't a complete solution because it's so expensive.
Right.
So the best hope, frankly, is that we take the best tech that we've got within the democracies, but we use the manufacturing industrial base of a country like South Korea to then produce it at scale.
Right.
And in fact, if you want a good example of that, you look at Poland, which, and we may talk a little bit about Donald Trump and what he's been up to in the last little bit. But with the risk of an American pullback from NATO hovering on the horizon as a reality, the Poles have decided they're going to become stronger militarily. They have a huge budget that they're spending, and half of that budget is actually being spent in, of all places, South Korea. Because what the South Koreans have been able to do on military kit is exactly what they've done on Hyundai and Kia and Samsung phones. They're not the best in the world, but they're 80% of the functionality of the best. And they're like 40% of the cost. And, quantity still matters. And if you get to enough quantity, it has a quality of its own when you can bring that to bear. So I think at its best, the alliance system is producing the top-tier technology, but then in a rational manner, having it produced not necessarily in the most expensive country, but to the benefit, again, of the entire alliance. And when that is really humming, then you've got a West or a democracy community that I think is going to be able to, A, deter the autocrats, and then if the autocrats are still dumb enough to test us, we will defeat them because you've really got all the democracies firing on all cylinders.
Right.
So that's my ultimate goal. And I talk in the book about some of the ways to achieve that. For instance, I'd like to extend NATO. I call it a GATO, a global alliance treaty organization. Bring in the Japanese, bring in South Korea, bring in Australia. It was just a happenstance of history that in the Pacific, you have hub and spoke with the Americans. They have their treaty with South Korea, and then they have a separate treaty with Japan, and they have a separate treaty with the Philippines, separate treaty with Australia. And we're now learning that the Achilles heel of that is if the Americans go on some isolationist path, those four countries, and Thailand is in the same boat, they're pretty exposed, and they have to quickly now cobble together something. Well, let's build all the democracies together. Because democracies, and let me just end on this, and again, it's talked about in the book because it's such an important concept. The democracies, by definition, follow the rule of law.
Right.
It's one of those three pillars, right? It's fair and free elections, because in a democracy, the people own the government. In an autocracy, the government owns the people. So that's why we have free and fair elections. We have human rights, and we have rule of law with independent judges. And a government that follows the rule of law domestically almost by sort of muscle memory, will follow the rules-based international order internationally.
Yeah.
Because that's what I do within my country, so it's easy for me to do it externally. If you're an autocrat and you don't do the rule of law domestically, well, I sort of get it. You're not going to do the rules-based international order internationally.
Right.
Because you're just not geared, and it's not in your DNA to do that. So I call in the book for, a greater cohesion amongst the democracies, because, we are all on the same team.
George, in your book, you discuss the subject of technology and national power. Could you expand on this important issue?
Yeah, I think it's actually critical to understand how innovation works in the modern age. And there's, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this.
Yes.
Do you remember this little device, the Sony Discman?
Yeah.
Which in its day was marvelous. You could actually take it out jogging, but if you walked or ran a little bit too quickly, it might skip and so on. And it was still a little bit big and cumbersome. And then along comes Apple.
Extraordinary.
And the first time I saw and used the iPod, I was just like, oh my God. Plus, you could navigate your playlists and so on. And what happened was, in short order, the iPod competitively displaced the Discman. And this is the essence of technological progress in the world, and it produces huge value, not just to the jogger or the music listener, but economically, it's a real driver. And what I argue in the book is that this sort of competitive displacement only goes on in a democracy. It's one of those, wonderful realities that you need freedom to do this.
Right.
Because in an autocracy, once the oligarch who's producing the Discman has the autocrat's ear and is paying him his, 15%, and then along comes the iPod guy.
Right.
He's either put in prison or he's discouraged or whatever because, don't upend the system. The system's actually really rewarding for me as the autocrat. And so the book goes through various examples where jet engines, as an example.
Right.
The Chinese just haven't been able to produce a jet engine. They're touting their new civilian airliner, the C919, as the first, because they hate paying for Boeing planes and Airbus planes. And yes, on the C919, they are making the fuselage. They're assembling the final piece. They even make the wings. The engines, they're made in the States and France. The avionics,
Right.
all in the democracies. And there's about 15 other high-tech critical components
Interesting.
that we're supplying. Now, it's an open question.
Yeah.
Why are we doing that? Why don't we say we need different behavior on the South China Sea? And if we don't see it, we're not going to supply you these engines. We've started to do that with computer chips, which is a good first step. We've started to do that with artificial intelligence. I would go further. I would put aircraft engines in there. So I'm not going to tell them how to live their lives and what kind of a system. I'm not looking for regime change. This isn't Dick Cheney saying, I'm going to bring democracy to Iraq. I'm not talking about any of that. But what I am saying is, if you want to participate in the marvels of technology of the West, you've got to adopt some of our rules. And it's like that notice, when you go through the airport security, and it's the bureaucrat that wrote this really should get like a gold medal. You don't have to go through security, and then you just won't get on the plane. That's all. So you don't have to adopt
Yes.
our Western rules of behavior, and you just won't get planes built with our technology. You have to keep buying,
Yes.
Boeing, which, if there's a conflict, and this is what they're finding in Russia, all the Boeing and Airbus planes are being grounded, and it's dangerous to fly now in Russia, and so on. And that's, of course, what Xi Jinping
Right.
wants to avoid. But why should we help them if they're not going to
Exactly.
help us?
George, you argue persuasively that democracies are more efficient and effective in the development of innovation than authoritarian regimes. Can you expand on this theme, and why is this so?
Well, in a sense, we were just chatting about this notion of competitive displacement, but there are some other drivers as well. The hottest semiconductor chip company right now is called NVIDIA.
Mm-hmm.
And they make these they design, that's actually my key point. They design the highest end chips that are particularly good at processing artificial intelligence. Jason Wang, who runs NVIDIA, was born in Taiwan, of all
Right.
places.
Ah.
Which is, now, the number 2 chip company in the world in terms of design is a company called AMD.
Right.
They have a woman CEO.
So, what's the pattern? Oh,
We do immigration, and we do it in a very big way in the tech space. I was reading that 5,000, serious tech companies in the U.S. have CEOs that were born in India. It includes Google,
Google, yes.
not a slouch. It includes Microsoft. It includes IBM, not a slouch. Previous president of IBM, a woman, Ginny Rometty.
Wow.
The number 2 defense contractor, so not Lockheed Martin, but the next one down, a woman is the CEO. Have a good look at the people around Putin and Xi Jinping. You'll be really hard-pressed to find women.
That's right.
You'll be really hard-pressed to find people of color or immigrants. There are some, but very, very rare. Sexual equality in the West. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, he's
Right.
gay. And I think Apple is, probably the premier tech company in the world right now. If you exclude gay people, people of color, immigrants, women, you're just not going to have a serious economy. It's like not just one arm behind your back tied. You're tying, all your legs, all your arms, and you're saying, okay, I now want to be world class. Can't be done. So these are these other strengths that you get when you have a political system that lets people choose their government, when you not just protect but encourage human rights. Now, I'm big with the Greeks on this. Everything in moderation. You can go too far.
Right.
On immigration, you do need walls, but you need gates
Yes,
within
absolutely.
the walls. And you have to do it. I mean, the U.S., frankly, it probably needs about 2 million people a year just because the economy is red hot, and they need a lot of additional workers. Birth rates are down.
Yes.
So there aren't enough babies being born. So immigration is critical, but you have to do it sensibly and with some rules, and you have to have housing and all those things that our own government is finally figuring out. But the direction that we have is totally the right direction. And actually, one of the biggest challenges for China is demographics.
Oh, yes.
Last year, for the second year running, their population has declined. Now, only by 2 million, which you think, oh, that's not big on 1.4 billion. But if you get into the math of demographics, And if your birth rate's not just below 2.1, which is the replacement rate, but now it's almost, well, in South Korea it's below 1. I think in China it's 1.1. You know exactly what's going to happen in 20
Yes.
years because you know how many women are being born or girls are being born now who will be, et cetera, et cetera. And the statistics are that China could easily go from 1.4 billion down to about 800 million by 2050 and down to 350 million by the end of the century, which, that's a shock to the system.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, in the book, in the biotechnology chapter, I talk about a technology called ectogenesis, which is basically an artificial uterus.
Yes.
And a lot of people won't like reading that part, and I'm going to get some criticism for that part. But we've got to start facing it. I mean, we have hearing aids, we have knee replacements, we have IVF for fertility clinics and so on. So this is coming, and I think the autocrats might dip into the ectogenesis technology. So anyway, all that to say that currently the democracies do technology the best, not just because of competitive displacement, but of our social, political rules. And the autocrats just don't get it. And they've tried to replicate some of our technologies, and so far, touch wood, they've failed.
This is good. George, your book also highlights the importance of creating and maintaining quality alliances like AUKUS that was recently forged. As well, you recognize the importance of increasing defense spending, as we have seen recently amongst the friendly and allied countries such as Finland, Sweden, and others. Where do you see Canada in this picture, not only as a member of NATO, NORAD, as well as a Pacific nation? And as a democratic nation and a member of a number of alliances, are we doing our share, or are we failing our duty to our friends and allies?
So the point that I make in the book is that alliances matter, and deep alliances, like the AUKUS one that you referred to, matter the most. AUKUS, just very quickly, it's between Australia, the US, and the United Kingdom. And in a nutshell, the United States is willing to share its nuclear propulsion technology for submarines. So not nuclear weapons, just right at the outset. This is not about nuclear weapons, but it is about nuclear propulsion technology, which, amongst other things, allows a submarine to stay submerged for 90 days. And as an Arctic nation, we sometimes forget that down here in the south, though it's about 20 degrees below in Ottawa right now outside, so I totally think of it as an Arctic nation. To do serious under-the-ice operations and so on, the Russians have nuclear-powered subs, the Chinese have nuclear-powered subs, and they're floating around under our ice right now. And all we've got are, binoculars off the deck of an icebreaker. So I won't say I was devastated because I'm a pretty tough guy, but I was very, very disappointed when AUKUS was announced and a C didn't figure in the acronym, particularly when you consider that there's actually a significant nuclear industry in Canada on the civilian side, on the power side, and on the isotope side. The Australians have zero nuclear capability. They're literally starting from scratch. They have no professors, no community colleges, nothing. So we were like tailor-made for that. The next technologies that AUKUS is going to be taking on is AI, artificial intelligence, and we actually have some pretty good AI going on in Canada. And then the next one is quantum computing, which I also talk about in the book, which is, in a sense, the successor to our current computing infrastructure and sort of universe. And quantum, when it really starts ramping up in a few years, though we already have quantum computers today, they will be able to solve problems in like 5 minutes that today our most powerful computers will take a year and a half. I mean, it's an order of magnitude. So we were made for AUKUS. Now, whether it was because we weren't invited, or if invited, we didn't really want to play, because it's not cheap.
Mhm.
The entry fee into AUKUS was probably $5 to $7 billion a year for 30 years, which is what the Australians are paying. Now, this gets into the second point of your question. If Canada were to be spending the notional 2% of GDP, that would mean roughly another $18 to $20 billion a year. And on a budget of $400 billion plus, it's actually not that much in the scheme of things. And then a third of that you could have spent on AUKUS. And right away you're in a different category of defense. Now, we can speculate, because I haven't talked to the Prime Minister about his decision. It might be even more than money. It might be we don't want to have the ability to be called on to help defend Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to put Canada into a war over Taiwan, which I think is the wrong way to think about the world. I think democracies need to help other democracies.
Right.
And actually, I'm currently working on another book focused on Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to tell you, they have a vigorous democracy. They have a wonderful civil society. They have a healthcare system, top-notch. They have an educational system. I would be proud to join in that coalition, because they deserve our support, just as the Ukrainians do. But we either won't be called on because we have ships that don't have appropriate air defense. And where that ultimately leads is not just we won't be able to help defend other democracies, but speaking of Donald Trump and his recent pronouncements about NATO,
Right.
we're one of those countries that he has an issue with. What if he turns to Ottawa and says, it's not just NATO, it's NORAD. And now you're on your own, Canada. We're going to be looking awfully exposed
Mm-hmm.
if all we've got for the time being are our ancient CF-18s. I worked on Parliament Hill as a junior staffer for an MP, but she was the Parliamentary Secretary for Defense, the Minister of Defense. So I was actually following the material for the CF-18
Right.
procurement. And they're still flying, and it's just, don't get me started. We're doing some really great things on procurement.
Mm-hmm.
The new ships, top-notch, it'll be wonderful, but they're not coming for 10, 15 years. They'll have Aegis air defense, which is great. The current ones don't. But we need the political leadership in this country to raise the profile of security. And that's a big reason, actually, why I wrote the book for a general audience.
Right.
Is to get maybe not the person on the street, but at least opinion makers to start writing op-eds and so on to say, look, if Ukraine teaches us anything, it's that you got to get the security insurance policy right. Because if you don't get that right, the new dental system, paid for dental, paid for pharma, increase this, all of that won't matter, because you're going to have much bigger problems. And I'm not saying go nuts at 5% of GDP and so on, but not meeting our 2%. And it's not just some arbitrary number. I mean, it was and that was the 2% because of the annexation of Crimea.
Right.
You could say that it should be 2.5, 3, 4 for what's currently going on. So for those ministers who are watching, I'm happy to elucidate further, but this is really serious stuff, and we've got to do a better job.
Mm-hmm. George, throughout your book, you argue that the new Cold War is not only ideological, but in tandem a technological conflict. Hence, you contend that political advantage, indeed success, during this period of geopolitical tensions will go to those nations who can effectively master these technological innovations, such as artificial intelligence. How do you see this situation evolving now and into the future, and what can be done to facilitate Western dominance?
So our current system of funding innovation, the venture capital system, the private equity financing level that comes in after the VC money, and then our public capital markets, that's all fairly sound, actually. And again, I talk about that, and I have charts that show just how much more money we spend on innovation than the autocracy. So tick that box. Another strength of ours is the university sector, and how, particularly in the STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, medicine, again, we've built some really fine institutions. In this country, we've got great research universities that are, spinning off, great technologies. So the fundamentals are there.
Right.
But we then need to be a little bit smarter on a number of fronts. We shouldn't, for instance, be giving rope to the autocrats with which to hang us. So-called export control and sanctions, it came out last year just as those Shahed drones were starting to land in Ukraine and were killing Ukrainians and Ukrainian soldiers. It came out that some British research scientists were joint venturing with Iranian research scientists on drone navigation technology. Like, shoot me now, right? So that's got to stop. And it's, we can talk about it at the margins and so on, but it's got to stop. And to its credit, the Canadian government in January, so about a month and a half ago, released guidance on how, Canadian researchers who work with colleagues in certain Chinese institutes in Russia and Iran, it's time to wind those down.
Right. And
I get it. There's an aspect of, freedom of research and that sort of thing. But, and I used to do a lot of work with spin-out companies from particularly the University of Toronto, University of Waterloo. And when you talk to a professor about these issues, they get it.
Yes.
Like, oh, right, yeah, okay, I see why we're doing this. But the book is partly aimed at them, as well as others, to sort of bring them up the curve. And unfortunately, where the world is coming to is a technologically bifurcated world.
Right.
And I don't want to sound like a 5-year-old, but the Chinese started it. When they shut off access to all the American, electronic social media systems like Amazon, Google, Facebook, like they were the ones who said, no, we need to create our own because we have our own autocratic agendas and so on. Well, we're now catching up.
Right.
And we're saying, you know what? You can't use our semiconductor chips. You can't use our AI. Interesting debate over TikTok, which is arguably still associated with China. There's going to be a fascinating debate and conflict over electronic vehicles coming from China,
Right.
because the automobile today is not just a mechanical device, it's actually a computer on wheels. And that computer is networked back to the manufacturer. So if you buy a BYD car, as they are in Europe, your driving habits, your spending habits, if you have a mistress, they know about it in Beijing because they can track where you've been driving. All of that's going back to China. Well, in my Cold War 2.0 analysis of the world, that's wrong. I don't want my data having anything to do with China or Russia, because that allows them to amplify their cognitive warfare. They now know me, and so on and so forth. So again, what you're going to have is this bifurcated world, not completely, because 90% of the stuff that's in Walmart that comes from China is fine.
Yeah.
Right? The shower curtains, the step stool, the cutlery, all of that's fine. But there'll be a technological decoupling. And I'm all for that. And then what we have to do within the democracies is make our AI safer for us, our social media safer. And then when we go into the global south, which is where there's going to be this huge contest, pick me kind of thing, we'll say, well, if you're a democracy in the global south, you'll like what we've got on offer. We'll probably lose a lot of autocrats in the global south because, and in fact, Beijing has sold its human surveillance system to 60 countries now.
Oh my God.
In the global south. So again, this is why I call it a Cold War, because unfortunately the world is taking these two sides. Now we have to keep talking. Climate change is global. The next pandemic, we need to talk about that. So there's lots that we can talk about. And even at the height of Cold War I, there was an American-Russian arms control treaty signed. So you can get things done, but the days when they can just have our technology willy-nilly, those days should be over.
George, I would like to thank you for a fascinating and insightful overview of a number of issues that we're contending not only in Canada but the Western democracies. And I would also like to commend to our audience the book. It is truly a fascinating overview of the threats that we're facing today and into tomorrow. Anyway, George, thank you again.
Thanks,
Lovely,
Greg.
and I hope to see you in the next edition of your book.
It's a real pleasure.
Cheers.